I learned some words in Hungarian. And one of these words is nem vagyok igazi professor. I'm not a real professor. I sometimes gave lectures at universities, a few lectures now and then. But I've never actually was a professor. So it's interesting people use this term. So they asked me to talk about my business, which is the war business, the Ukraine war business. So the first thing we must all recognize that the Ukrainian war is maybe the most normal war in history. It's a completely normal war. First of all, the information reaching President Putin from their intelligence organization, which was the FSB, because they considered Ukraine part of Russia. So it's the internal organization. Not FBI, I mean, not CIA, but FBI. Is the Americans decide to conquer Patagonia or something, and they give the job to the FBI because they say Patagonia belongs to the United States or something like that. This intelligence was the normal intelligence. That is, it was completely wrong. Completely wrong. The intelligence scenario was that the beautiful military operation, very elegant military operation, people arrived with helicopters, you know, nice desantniki, you know, Russian airborne assault, professionals. They arrive with helicopters on the Antonov field. They take the Antonov field because it's a very long field. The Antonov airplanes are very big. It's a very long airstrip, so actually you can have even two different airplane landings, takeoffs on the same field. Very close to Kiev. Very close, much closer than Boryspil, the international airport. Antonov is right there. You arrive there with these fellows in helicopters, then they open the field for the Ilyushins from Russia to bring airborne troops. Then they match up with BTR, which is the same vehicle which is parked outside, 8-wheelers. I've used one myself. They're perfectly wonderful vehicles. They go fast, and you know, they're very good. So they jump on them, they go into Kiev, and take over the Ministry of Defense, Presidential Palace. Zelensky, of course, has run away. The government is dissolved. The Ukrainians have no orders, so everybody surrenders. And then there is a big parade, big parade of armored vehicles coming through Kiev to generate impressions, photographs, showing irresistible army. Irresistible army. Everybody surrenders. In 5 days, Russia has Ukraine. That was the intelligence and the military plan. The military plan was very beautiful. It was done by people who had never actually been in war at all. Maybe they were in Syria, which is not real, of course. Like the Americans in Afghanistan learned nothing. Fighting in Afghanistan teaches you zero about real war in Europe. So it was a beautiful military plan, very clever, with the helicopters, the airplanes, and then the BTRs coming from Belarus, and then doing the done. It's a beautifully done plan, as usual, and the intelligence. Now, the American intelligence was exactly the same. Exactly the same. They will arrive, Zelensky, the comedian, will run away, the government will dissolve, left without orders, the Ukrainians will surrender, and Ukraine will be there. Now, the American intelligence was shared with the Germans, which is always a mistake. One should never tell Germans anything. And the German BND, the German intelligence, told the chancellor that if there is something in Ukraine, it would last less than 5 days. Less than 5 days, there'd be no real fighting. So the German chancellor said that if there is something in Ukraine, they will not stop Nord Stream 2. Nord Stream 2, the big gas from Russia for the Baltic, which was a very clever idea because since there's more gas all around the world, there's more gas. I actually have a friend of mine who invested in gas development in the East Mediterranean, and he found a very small gas thing, and that's already a lot of gas. Even the smallest field in the Mediterranean, which is not really a gas place, is already huge. So because of that, the Germans decided to tie themselves to a single supplier. Like you make a contract that you will only eat in one restaurant. Only one restaurant. You'll be there every day, breakfast, lunch, and dinner, no matter what the food is. Great contract. So the Germans send a signal to Putin saying, you know, if you invade Ukraine, there'll be no problem with the German business. You know, Geschäft is Geschäft, business is business, don't worry about it. So the first thing is that the Russian president was disinformation. Now, Biden is a very old guy, he's also very experienced, but the intelligence seemed overwhelming, and so he offered, as everybody knows, the first night of the war to evacuate Zelensky. When this offer was made by Biden to Zelensky, you know that American intelligence knew nothing, zero. They knew nothing. They had taken all the pictures from the satellites. They could see all the big Russian armored vehicle column getting ready, you know, with thousands of vehicles getting ready. They could see that. They also had a couple of spies who told them about this beautiful thing. So you had a group of Russians who had never fought a war. Never fought a war, except Syria and so on. A group of Americans who never fought a war. Because Afghanistan, fighting Iraq, these places, this is not real war. Real war is when you're fighting patriotic Europeans. When you're fighting patriotic Europeans, the war lasts many years, many people get killed. So nobody around the table. So I was very embarrassing for me because I earn a living as a Pentagon advisor. So I keep going to meetings, and there are all these generals sitting there with all their beautiful ribbons from all their different things, you know, hundreds of different things on them. None of them had ever fired a gun. He never raised a rifle and shot at the enemy. I did that. They never used a bazooka. They never seen a tank actually moving, but they knew everything about war. And what is it they knew, the Russians and the Americans? They knew is the following. We are now in a new era of that's a phrase, post-kinetic warfare. Post-kinetic. Now, what is kinetic? Well, that's Achilles hitting Hector. Hector hitting Achilles. Or me shooting my old rifle. My first rifle I shot in the war was bolt action. Can you imagine? Like this, boom, boom. Now, none of that. We are post-kinetic. It's information warfare. It's cyber warfare. It's postmodern, whatever they call it. The Russians used hybrid warfare. The Americans used fourth generation. So all these generals who had never really fought a war all believed in this modern post-kinetic warfare. Namely, that the war starts, and the Ukrainian soldier takes out his iPhone, and he sees these images of tanks coming, and he surrenders. That was the basic scheme. So, as I say, it's a normal war, because the history of war shows that people begin wars with great fantasies. War, I mean, you wouldn't get out of bed and start a war unless you believed a beautiful dream. A beautiful dream. You're going to go there. I remember in 2003 in the United States, they decided to go to Iraq. And you can look it up online. I was testifying before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. The chairman was Biden, Senator Biden. And the administration witness says, if we go to Iraq and take away Saddam Hussein, there'll be democracy in Iraq. And my testimony was very negative, and it's all there. You can see it on the internet. I said, look, in Iraq there are Shia and Sunni. There are Kurds and Arabs. There are Turkmen and Kurds. So actually Saddam Hussein is keeping them from killing each other. If you remove Saddam Hussein, we have to convert the US Army into a Mesopotamian police force. Also, by the way, if you destroy the Iraqi army, you need a Mesopotamian army to control the Iranians. So I gave this testimony, and the answer from the administration completely defeated me, completely. They won 100 against me, 0. Because they said, Mr. Luttwak here is saying that the Iraqis are not capable of democracy. That is a racist comment. That there, racist comment. So I said, it's not racist, it's culturalist. And I said, by the way, I've been to Iraq. I've actually met Kurds. Even met Turkmen. And of course, I met Arabs. And nothing. The administration, I said, look, the problem is democracy is kind of difficult. Except they won completely the argument that Iraq is... So Putin is in the same situation. If the court in The Hague sends a commando team of lawyers and parachute to the Kremlin, capture Putin, and then they take him to The Hague to be tried, the first thing he will say is, who of you here would not have done what I did? Imagine that your intelligence tells you that you will capture Europe's biggest country in 5 days. Who would not do that? I mean, you don't have to be a militarist nationalist. You can capture Europe's biggest country in 5 days. That's what my intelligence said, and that's what we know from the German spies we have, what the American intelligence said. So this is the normal stuff of the war. Now, what then happened is also very normal, which is the Ukrainians, of course, were patriotic. They did not surrender. Post-kinetic war is a fantasy. The Russian hybrid war theory is a fantasy. The American postmodern war was a fantasy, but that's also normal. Remember how the First World War started with a fantasy, Second World War, that's how you need a fantasy in that. That's all very normal. Then happened the other normal, which is attrition. Attrition. Attrition is like this, okay? Not beautiful operation, the war ends in 24 hours. No, attrition. Somebody is shooting somebody, the other guy is shooting you, face to face. That's what's been happening. And the Ukrainians were able to control the Russian advance, and then they were able to, where the Russians had jumped forward, like Kharkiv. Kharkiv is the second city in Ukraine. It's a big place. They rushed forward with forces, took Kharkiv the first day, and then they lost it. So we've had attrition. What does attrition mean is that if you are Zelensky and Reznikov, the defense minister, Zelensky, every morning they wake up and the Russians have done this, the Russians have that, and the Ukrainians respond. They bombed, they advanced, in Bakhmut they tried to advance, you respond. So you are making no decisions. The Russians are making every decision, and you just have to respond. And how do you respond? By going to the front and sending people to fight and so on. This is the kind of fighting that was in the First World War. First World War, people shooting each other directly and so on. And in this kind of war can last for 20 years. And it's governed only by the availability of troops. So in the Ukrainian case, every day somebody becomes 18 years old. Every day in Ukraine, become 18 years old. That's when you enter the military system for training, and within 6 months you are a fully made soldier. Sometimes it's 4 months, sometimes it's 3 months. And that is, you are supplying the war with young people who have been trained up, ready to be sent. On the Russian side, Putin, because the conquest of Ukraine was not a war, but he called it a special military operation. How do you say that in Hungarian? Yeah, special military operation. So he did not declare war. Actually, Russia never declared war, because you cannot fight part of your own country. You know, it's like Budapest declaring war on Szeged or something, Szeged, or whatever it's called, Szeged. Yes. No, Szeged is the Romanian one. There's two of them, right? So, you did not declare war. He did not mobilize the Russian army, because the Russian army, every single division, brigade, regiment, the Russian army has conscripts. Conscripts from the year 17 and a half, 18 years old, 19 years old, and he did not want to send the Russian army to fight, because in each unit there are young, new soldiers. And if he did that, it would not be the Moscow we have seen for a year and months, the quiet Moscow. There will be a lot of mothers protesting. And Putin didn't want to face the mothers protesting. Everybody remembers what happened in Afghanistan in Soviet days. Okay? The mothers started protesting that their boys were dying in a place called Afghanistan. What are they doing in Afghanistan? Why is my son dead in Afghanistan? The Soviet regime could not tolerate that. They couldn't stand it. So he did not declare war. He did not mobilize the army. Who has been fighting? Who has been fighting? Well, the first 24 hours, it was the professional military of the airborne, the elite, so on, well-paid professional military, well-selected, well-trained. They fought and then they stopped because their job was not to fight a grinding war, but just to grab things very fast in a beautiful, beautiful plan they had. So they were there at the beginning and hardly afterwards. Then they had the contract soldiers. Contract soldiers, units of contract soldiers, people from Russia, all over Russia, theoretically, who join up to the army and they had been serving before. Perhaps they were infantrymen, perhaps they were artillerymen, perhaps they were cooks, perhaps they were clerks, but they were paying them $3,000 a month. $3,000 a month. You know, and they were willing to cover. So all these fighters and so on. Where did they come from? Not from Moscow, not from Petersburg, not from Kazan, which is Tatarstan, because there's oil money in Tatarstan. So none of the Tatars signed up. So who came? Came Buryats, the people living beyond Mongolia. And of course, the people from Dagestan and Caucasus and kind of peripheral areas where there was no jobs, no money, no chances, no nothing. So they signed up for contract. And they're fighting for $2,000, $3,000, whatever they were paying them. They paid different levels, dollars a month. So they were mercenaries. Mercenaries. And mercenaries can be very good soldiers, but not in this case. They were not good soldiers. So you have contract soldiers and so on, and then you have the Chechen volunteers. Early in the war, there were pictures showing the Chechen volunteers. They all have beards. They were nice, well-fed fellows, and they said, we're going to kill everybody, kill everybody. Then they met the first Ukrainian. The Ukrainians killed quite a few of them. They went back to Chechnya. Okay, this is Kadyrov, very good for filming purposes. Obviously, really ridiculous. That thing, all the world news media were dominated by the Chechen. You know, they thought the Chechen are like the Huns of Attila. No, they were not. They were just nice people who wear uniforms and were, you know, not really soldiers at all. They had no experience. So after all these adventures and things, Wagner. Now, Wagner is also completely normal in human history to have mercenaries. And mercenaries can fight very well, of course. They have reasons to. You take it out to prison and you fight in the war. The British Army traditionally was raised from people who were in prison or would go to prison and would come into the British Army, and they turned them into the fine British soldiers. Some of them got medals and so on and so forth. The British Army for centuries was living from people like Wagner, and they did very well, actually. However, there aren't enough of them. There are very few. This is a business. Prigozhin takes a lot of money. It's not really good. This is how things have happened. And finally, they called reservists. These are actually normal Russians, not Buryats or whatever, not mercenaries, who served in the Russian army and then signed that they're willing to be in the reserves. And they called 300,000 of them. Now, 100,000 of them lost their way. They called 300,000. 100,000, they lost their way, and some of them ended up in Kazakhstan. Other people are in Hollywood, in Los Angeles, working in Los Angeles. About 200,000 actually arrived, and that is what the Russian army trained and so on. They now have 150,000 of them. Somewhere. Because if you follow the news of the war, the fighting is only in one place, Bakhmut, and the only people fighting is Wagner, which means that there's somewhere 150,000 Russians who are willing, who are ready, they're being prepared to launch an offensive. The world is speaking about the Ukrainian offensive. So what the Ukrainians did, they were able to fight better and better, so they did not have to send every soldier to the front, and they could start keeping them back. Trained, armed, being exercised, and not at the front. So this is called an operational reserve, an operational reserve. Operational reserve is the equivalent of capital in business. If you have capital, you can do things. You know, you can go on holiday to the Maldives or Seychelles, or you can start a shop and do. So the operational reserves of the Ukrainians are the young people who came in who were trained and were not sent to the front. And they were already being prepared for a big offensive. And the Russians have their reservists and some others ready for their offensive. So the whole world media is talking about the Ukrainian offensive, and the Russian, nobody talks about the Russian offensive. But actually, after all this slow war that doesn't change day after day, both sides are getting ready to do big things, because that's what you do, a big thing. So what example, in a map of Ukraine, you know, Ukraine is, the whole thing is shaped by the Dnieper River, and a lot of Russians below the Dnieper River. So the big operation that the Ukrainians could do is to go from Zaporozhye at the corner of the Dnieper and to go straight to the Black Sea. If they go straight to the Black Sea, all the Russians who are west of this line, they are depending on roads and rail lines, railways and roads, and the Ukrainians would cut it. So all these Russians potentially could be captured. And this will be a kind of Stalingrad type situation. Well, not Stalingrad, it's like the encirclements of the Second World War. The Russian operation can be different, but one operation they cannot do. The only operation that could win the war for the Russians is to capture Kiev. And Kiev they cannot do, because in Kiev, everybody in Kiev has at least one bazooka. So entering Kiev becomes like Stalingrad. Not a beautiful operation at all. You're just getting people shooting at you from buildings. Not nice. So the Russian operation cannot end the war, and the Ukrainian operation cannot end the war. They can only create conditions for negotiations. The purpose of war is to bring peace. The purpose of war is always to bring peace by burning the means, by killing people until both sides say enough. Okay? The war, we all remember, 1945, with the Russian army entering Berlin, that is completely abnormal. Wars do not end like that. Wars end at a certain point. Somebody says, I'm losing, like the First World War. The First World War ended when the German army said we're losing. Not a single British, Belgian, or French soldier had entered Germany. Germany was intact. There had been a few bombings, a few buildings. Germany was intact, but the German army said, that's it, we surrender. That's normal. 1945 was not normal, and Ukraine war must end in a normal way, which is that either the Ukrainians do an offensive, the Russians do an offensive, while one of the two succeeds, doesn't, and there's a negotiation. So we have these big offensives give the opportunity to end this war. So this is an unusual thing, and the only thing for me personally is that I was forced to do something I really hated because of this war. I had to start a Twitter account. I never had any social media at all. I had to start a Twitter account when I told the Pentagon, that told the president, that if the Russians invade the biggest country in Europe with this tiny army, with this baby army, of 127,000 soldiers, including dentists, and they invade Europe's biggest country, they will be completely defeated. And the head of the Avril Haines, the head of national intelligence, told the president that they would capture Kiev in 24 hours and Ukraine in 5 days. So then I started my Twitter account and I said, the people in US intelligence don't know Ukraine. They don't know Ukrainians. Ukrainians will fight like heroes. Putin will lose. I wrote in the Twitter. So then she went to the Secretary of Defense and said, fire him because he's saying that we are completely wrong. He's telling the president that we are completely wrong. You know, it's creating confusion. I'm the head of intelligence. He's just a consultant. And, I was not fired. So I went immediately and I said, they're trying to fire me because I'm saying that you cannot invade Europe's biggest country with a very small army. And I said in 1968, Czechoslovakia was 20% of the size of Ukraine, and its population was 25%. But in 1968, 800,000 troops entered Czechoslovakia, including Hungarian troops from the south. There were Russian troops from Ukraine. There were East German troops coming south. And of course, a lot of Russian troops from Poland entered. 800,000. And they are trying to invade Ukraine, which is 5 times bigger, with 135,000. This is so simple. But simple things never stop people starting wars. Like when somebody told the Japanese, you know, you attack the Americans, and after Pearl Harbor, you have to land in California, and you have to march to Washington and force them to sign the peace treaty. And, you know, they never say these things. That's how wars happen, of course. But anyway, I wasn't fired, but unfortunately, she was not fired. She's still there. The Russian colleague, the Russian general of the FSB, who told Putin that they put him not to a prison. In Moscow, some of you probably know, there's a actually beautiful prison next to the Moscow River. It's called Matrosha Tisana, the Health of the Sailor. It's a beautiful building, really elegant, and the prisoners can see the river and so on. You know. No, they didn't put him there. They put him in Lefortovo Fortress. Unfortunately, the head of our intelligence is not in prison, as they should be. And of course, the German head. So the only one who was honorable, and this is France, France, the head of French military intelligence, who told the same thing to the French government, he resigned. He said, I was completely wrong, and he resigned. Only the French. The others are still there. So this is part of the story as well. A final thing I have to say is about languages. There are some Erasmus students here and who are experiencing the Hungarian language. And that is a very important thing to do, because once you experience Hungarian and you learn a little bit of Hungarian, enough to go to a bar and order 1 beer, after that you can learn Korean, Japanese, just like that. You know? Very easy compared to it. I mean, I speak quite a lot of Japanese. And Americans think Japanese is difficult, but since I know Hungarian, I know it's that easy language and so on. Thank you very much, and I'll stop right there.